A racist officer snatches a Bible from a black elderly man, but he doesn't realize the man's son is an Army general. 80-year-old Samuel Price had lived a life of faith and resilience. A retired pastor, he found solace in the small routines that anchored his days. The creak of his old wooden floors greeted him each morning as he rose before sunrise. He would shuffle to the kitchen, boil water for tea, and sit by the window with his Bible, the leather soft and worn from years of use. It was more than a book to Samuel. It was his wife's last gift to him, a relic of love and strength that had seen him through the decades since her passing. This morning was no different. After finishing his tea, Samuel slid the Bible under his arm, grabbed his cane, and stepped out into the cool autumn air. The neighborhood, quiet in the early hours, was bathed in hues of gold and amber as the sun filtered through the trees. Samuel walked with a deliberate pace, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk as he made his way to the park a few blocks away. The park was a modest one, with a handful of benches and a path that wound its way around a pond. Samuel had been coming here for years, drawn by the tranquility it offered. His favorite bench, shaded by an old oak tree, sat in a corner of the park where the noise of the world felt far away. As he eased himself onto the bench, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath his shoes, he felt a familiar sense of peace settle over him. Samuel opened his Bible, the spine creaking gently, and began reading aloud in a soft, steady voice. The words of Psalms filled the quiet space around him, a melody of faith whispered to no one but himself and the heavens. The air was cool against his skin, and he let his gaze lift momentarily to watch a squirrel dart across the path. He felt at ease, the moment wrapping around him like a warm embrace. The serenity was broken by the low hum of a car engine. Samuel didn't pay it much mind at first, assuming it was someone passing through the nearby street. But the hum grew louder, then cut off abruptly. The sound of a car door slamming pulled his attention away from his reading. Turning his head, Samuel saw a patrol car parked just beyond the park's entrance. The driver's side door had swung open, and a man in a police uniform stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements sharp and purposeful. Samuel's brow furrowed as the man strode toward him, the crunch of his boots on the gravel path breaking the stillness. Officer Rick Daniels was a familiar figure in the neighborhood. Known for his heavy-handed approach, he had built a reputation as someone who operated more on intimidation than duty. His presence rarely meant anything good. Samuel kept his gaze steady, his fingers resting lightly on the pages of his Bible as Rick's shadow stretched across the bench. "What are you doing here, old man?" Rick's voice was sharp, his tone carrying an edge of accusation. Samuel closed his Bible gently, looking up at the officer. His expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of unease in his chest. He explained that he was reading, something he did every morning, and assured Rick that he wasn't causing any trouble. Rick's lips curled into a sneer. Crossing his arms, he leaned slightly forward, his posture radiating hostility. "This is a public park," Rick said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "People don't just sit around reading unless they're up to something. What are you really doing?" Samuel frowned slightly, his voice steady as he repeated himself. He was simply reading, enjoying the peace of the morning. Rick's eyes narrowed. His stance shifted, becoming more aggressive as he loomed over the elderly man. "Don't lie to me," Rick snapped. "I've seen your kind hanging around here, loitering, acting like you own the place. You're not fooling anyone." Samuel straightened his back, his hand tightening slightly on the handle of his cane. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer, I'm not causing any trouble," he said quietly, his voice firm but respectful. Rick took another step forward, his boots nearly touching the edge of the bench. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he barked, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of a jogger passing by on the trail. "I said, stand up, now!" Samuel hesitated, his brow furrowing in disbelief at the command. There was no reason for this escalation. He glanced at his Bible, still resting on the bench, before slowly setting his cane down and pushing himself to his feet. His movements were deliberate, his joints stiff from age, but he rose with as much dignity as he could muster. Once upright, Samuel met Rick's glare. "I'm just an old man trying to enjoy the morning," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had faced far greater storms than this. "There's no need for this hostility." Rick's eyes burned with an anger that seemed to have no source but his own prejudice. He took another step closer, his face mere inches from Samuel's. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he growled. "Let's see what you've got in that book." Samuel's breath caught in his throat as Rick reached out, his hand moving toward the Bible. He felt the quiet peace of the morning slipping away, replaced by a mounting tension that made his chest tighten. Whatever happened next, Samuel knew, would not be easy. Before Samuel could react, Rick's hand shot forward, snatching the Bible from the bench as if it were evidence of a crime. The elderly man's heart sank as he reached out instinctively, his voice trembling with both fear and urgency. He asked Rick to return it, his tone polite but pleading. Rick smirked, ignoring Samuel's outstretched hand. He held the Bible up, flipping it open with one hand and rifling through its delicate pages as if he were searching for contraband. The carelessness in his movements made Samuel wince, and his voice quavered as he begged Rick to be careful. "What's so special about this?" Rick sneered, glancing at Samuel with disdain. "What, you think carrying this thing around makes you better than everyone else?" Samuel's breath quickened as he watched Rick thumb through the fragile, time-worn pages. The sound of the paper crinkling was like a knife to his heart. "Please, officer," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "That Bible is all I have left of my wife. It means everything to me." Rick laughed, a harsh and bitter sound that echoed in the quiet park. "Spare me the sob story, old man," he said, his lip curling into a sneer. He paused for a moment, holding the Bible aloft as if it were something ridiculous, something unworthy of respect. Without warning, Rick tossed the Bible onto the ground. The leather cover hit the dirt with a dull thud, sending up a small cloud of dust. Samuel froze in disbelief, his chest tightening as he stared at the book lying crumpled on the earth. "No!" Samuel gasped, his voice hoarse as he bent down to retrieve it. His hands trembled as he reached for the Bible, but before he could grasp it, Rick's heavy hand pressed against his shoulder, shoving him back forcefully. Samuel stumbled, his cane slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. He fell awkwardly onto the bench, his frail frame jolting from the impact. Pain shot through his back and shoulders, but the humiliation cut deeper. "Stay where you are," Rick barked, his voice booming with authority. He stood over Samuel, his presence oppressive and menacing. "You think carrying a Bible around makes you innocent? People like you are always up to something." Samuel looked up at Rick, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his voice failed him. Rick leaned closer, his face contorted with anger and arrogance. "You're lucky I don't cuff you right here," he said, jabbing a finger toward Samuel's chest. "You think anyone cares about your little church stories? You're just another old nobody." The words struck Samuel like blows, each one chipping away at his dignity. He sat frozen, unable to move or speak, as Rick straightened and turned his attention back to the Bible lying in the dirt. With a dismissive motion, Rick kicked the book, sending it skidding across the ground. The fragile pages fluttered as the Bible came to rest against the base of the tree, a torn page dangling from the spine. Samuel's breath hitched as he saw the damage, his chest aching with sorrow and helplessness. Rick stood tall, adjusting his uniform with a smug expression. Satisfied with his display of dominance, he spat on the ground near Samuel's feet. "Stay out of my park," Rick said coldly, his voice dripping with disdain. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. The engine roared to life, and the patrol car sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Samuel sat frozen on the bench, his breathing shallow as he tried to process what had just happened. Minutes passed before he moved, his trembling hands reaching for his cane. With great effort, he pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting the strain. Slowly, he shuffled toward the tree where his Bible lay, each step heavier than the last. When he finally reached it, Samuel bent down carefully, his fingers brushing the dirt from its worn cover. His hands lingered on the torn page, smoothing it gently as tears welled in his eyes. The ache in his chest was more than physical. It was the pain of being treated as less than human, of seeing something so sacred to him desecrated without a second thought. He clutched the Bible to his chest, his head bowing as he whispered a quiet prayer for strength. Samuel turned and began the slow walk home, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. The peace he had felt that morning had been shattered, replaced by a deep sadness that hung over him like a storm cloud. With every step, he clung tighter to his Bible, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. As he approached his modest home, Samuel paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. He placed the Bible carefully on the kitchen table, its torn page a glaring reminder of the morning's events. Lowering himself into a chair, he sat in silence, his hands resting on the table as he replayed the encounter in his mind. The stillness of the house offered no comfort. Samuel's heart ached, but he knew this pain was not new. It was the same pain he had carried for decades, the burden of enduring injustice while clinging to faith. But this time, it felt heavier, as though the years had finally caught up with him. Samuel stared at the Bible, the edges of its pages still dusted with dirt, and silently prayed for the strength to carry on. Hours later, Marcus Price arrived at his father's modest home, his boots echoing heavily on the wooden porch before he opened the door. Marcus, a decorated Army general with over 2 decades of service, carried himself with the unwavering presence of a man accustomed to command. His broad shoulders, straight posture, and sharp uniform gave him an air of authority, but today his demeanor softened slightly as he stepped inside the home he had grown up in. "Dad?" Marcus called out, his deep voice resonating through the quiet house. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his Bible, its once pristine pages now visibly damaged. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to smooth out a torn page, his fingers brushing over the frayed edges as though willing it to mend itself. The sight immediately put Marcus on edge. He wasn't used to seeing his father, his rock, his moral compass, looking so defeated. Samuel's weariness was written across his face, the lines around his eyes deeper than Marcus remembered. "What happened, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. He moved closer, his sharp eyes taking in the scene, the dirt still clinging to the Bible's cover, the heaviness in Samuel's posture, the way his hands lingered over the damaged page. Samuel hesitated, glancing up at his son before looking away. He shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the morning's events. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his strong, steady presence encouraging Samuel to speak. At first, Samuel tried to brush it off, muttering that it wasn't important, but Marcus pressed, leaning forward slightly as he told his father that he needed to know. "Tell me what happened," he urged, his voice soft but unyielding. With a heavy sigh, Samuel began to recount the encounter in halting sentences. He spoke of how Officer Rick Daniels had approached him in the park, how the man's hostility had turned into outright aggression. His voice trembled as he described the moment Rick had snatched the Bible from his hands, the mocking words, and the way he had been shoved back onto the bench like a criminal. As Samuel spoke, Marcus's jaw tightened. His fists clenched on the table, the muscles in his forearms taut as he fought to maintain his composure. The rage that simmered beneath the surface wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was cold and deliberate, a fury honed by years of discipline. When Samuel finished, he looked up at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Marcus reached out, placing a hand over his father's trembling fingers. "Do you remember his name?" Marcus asked, his voice low and steady, though the intensity in his tone was unmistakable. Samuel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper as he recalled the officer's name and badge number. He recited the details carefully, as though passing on the weight of the encounter to someone who could carry it better. Marcus nodded in return, his expression hardening into one of quiet resolve. He rose from his chair, straightening his uniform as his towering frame filled the room. "I'll take care of it, Dad," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. He looked down at Samuel, his eyes filled with both determination and the unspoken promise of justice. Samuel nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time that day. He watched as Marcus walked toward the door, his steps purposeful and unwavering, and a faint glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. Marcus had never made a promise he didn't keep. The next morning, Marcus stood in the center of his father's living room, adjusting the medals on his dress uniform. The room was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the windows casting long shadows across the floor. His face was calm, but his sharp, focused eyes betrayed the storm within. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a symbol of who he was, a man who didn't back down from injustice, especially not when it involved his family. Samuel sat at the kitchen table nearby, his repaired Bible resting in his hands. The lines on his face seemed deeper today, and his posture carried a weariness that Marcus hadn't seen before. "I don't want trouble, Marcus," Samuel said softly, his voice tinged with a mix of fatigue and resignation. "I just want to move on." Marcus crossed the room and knelt beside his father, his large hand resting gently on Samuel's shoulder. He looked up into his father's tired eyes, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Dad, this isn't just about what happened yesterday," Marcus said. "It's about making sure no one disrespects you, or anyone else like that again. I won't let this go." Samuel hesitated, searching his son's face for a moment before nodding slowly. Marcus rose, adjusting his uniform one final time before stepping out of the house. His steps were firm and unyielding as he made his way to the precinct, his mind focused on one thing: holding Officer Rick Daniels accountable. When Marcus entered the precinct, his presence was impossible to ignore. The medals gleaming on his uniform and the authority in his stride drew every eye in the room. Without hesitation, he approached the front desk and demanded to speak with the precinct captain. His commanding tone left no room for debate, and the desk officer quickly ushered him into a small office where Captain Randall waited. The captain, a grizzled man with decades of experience, looked up as Marcus entered. He didn't need an introduction to recognize the weight of Marcus's rank and presence. Marcus introduced himself formally, stating his rank and purpose before launching into a precise and measured recounting of what had happened to his father. He spoke without raising his voice, but every word carried weight. He detailed the officer's aggression, the snatching of the Bible, and the physical and verbal abuse that followed. As he spoke, his sharp eyes never left the captain, cutting through any potential dismissiveness or excuses. "I'm here as a son, not just as a soldier," Marcus said, his voice steady and deliberate. "And I won't stand for this kind of behavior from someone who's sworn to protect and serve. This isn't just about my father, it's about the principles of honor and respect. Principles I've dedicated my life to." The captain listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, he nodded slowly and assured him that the matter would be addressed. But Marcus didn't move. "With all due respect, Captain," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a calm but commanding tone. "This isn't something you address. This is something you fix. Today." The captain, sensing the weight of Marcus's resolve, nodded again, this time more firmly. He promised action, and Marcus left the room knowing that the situation was now impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, Officer Rick Daniels was called into the precinct, where he was confronted by the captain and an internal affairs officer. The weight of Marcus's detailed report, combined with Samuel's account, left Rick with no room to deny his actions. Rick was placed on immediate suspension, and an internal review was launched. Marcus requested to meet with Rick personally. In a small, dimly lit room at the precinct, the two men faced each other. Rick sat slouched in his chair, his bravado diminished in the face of Marcus's unwavering presence. "You disrespected my father," Marcus began, his voice low but firm. "A man who's lived more life and shown more grace than you ever will. You humiliated him, but you didn't break him. You threw his Bible on the ground, but you didn't take his faith. And now you'll face the consequences of your actions." Rick looked away, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond. Marcus straightened, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the room. "This isn't just about punishment," Marcus said, his voice cold and steady. It's about making sure people like you understand that power doesn't come without accountability." Rick remained silent, his silence a mixture of shame and resignation. Marcus turned and left the room, his mission complete. Later that evening, Marcus returned home to find his father sitting in his favorite chair, the Bible resting on his lap. Marcus sat down beside him, the tension of the day easing as he looked into his father's grateful eyes. "It's done," Marcus said simply. Samuel nodded, his weathered hands stroking the Bible's worn cover. "Thank you, son," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride and relief. For the first time in days, a sense of peace settled over the house. Together, they sat in silence, their bond stronger than ever.